Hello, good afternoon, good morning. Here's the Japan Zoominar at UC San Diego. I'm Ulrike Schaede. I'm the director of JFIT, the Japan Center at UC San Diego. We are at GPS, the School of Global Policy and Strategy. We are an international relations and public policy school with a focus on the Pacific Rim. We have a degree in an MIA with a Japan specialization. If you're interested in our degree programs, please go to gps.ucsd.edu. And at GPS, we have JFIT, our Japan Center. The website for JFIT is jfit.ucsd.edu. There you can also find recordings of past Zoominars, and soon we will have a library of Zoominars for teaching purposes as well. I also have my own website, thejapanologist.com, where I update on the Zoominars as well. The Zoominar is a weekly event. And today, of course, we're going to talk about U.S.-Japan relations after the election. Next week, please join me. We're going back to the humanities, and we'll have our UCSD colleague, Daisuke Miyao, talk about Japanese movies and the history of the Japanese cinema. This will be followed after, with the topics on SoftBank and China and business relations and so forth. It's all on our website. While I have your attention, allow me to ask, this is now becoming more common in podcasts, and I would be amiss if I did not also make sure that you understand how you can help us. We are, of course, a public university, and even though it is much cheaper to do these events on Zoom, it is not entirely costless. There's staff support, there's Zoom costs, there's, of course, the marketing and the processing. If you find these Zoominars at all of value, it would be terrific if you could consider going to jfit.ucsd.edu/support and click one of these golden Give Now buttons to help us. Any amount will help. $25, $50 will help just as much as some of the larger gifts that thankfully we have already received. So if this is at all of value, please consider making a donation to our center. Today, I am tickled pink to have three of my colleagues with me. We will talk about, and I'll introduce them now, let me just get out of here, to discuss what the outcome or probable outcome of the US elections means for US-Japan relations and the relations in the Pacific. Let me introduce the three. I'll begin with Ellis Krauss, who is Professor Emeritus at GPS. He joined GPS in 1995, so we've been colleagues for 25 years. He is a professor of political science, and prior to being here, he was at Pittsburgh and at Western Washington University. He is the recipient of the Order of the Rising Sun, 3rd class, with gold leaves and neck ribbon, and has written 6 books and an uncountable number of, is it 7 now? Sorry, 2 new ones, yes. So I can't keep up with Ellis's productivity on domestic politics in Japan and US-Japan relations. So thank you, Ellis, for joining us, and it's great to have you. Megumi Naoi is Associate Professor of Political Science at our UCSD Department of Political Science. She is an international and comparative political economy expert and specializes on trade and redistribution matters. She has at least 1 book and 1 in preparation, although I may be undercounting that as well, a large number of articles in leading top tier journals, which reflect her status of one of the rising next generation Japan scholars, if you're next gen, maybe you've already arrived, I actually think. She has a PhD from Columbia and an MA and BA from Keio University, all in political science. And last but not the least, we have with us Robert Thomas Jr., who is a retired Vice Admiral of the U.S. Navy and a professor of practice at GPS. Admiral Thomas, thank you for joining us today. Robert has served in the US military for 38 years. He has a BS in civil engineering from UC Berkeley and an MA in national security studies from the National War College. And his career was mostly as a submarine officer, probably one of the vessels that I would be least excited to be on. He served on the U.S. Pacific Command, tech submarines force, and was the commander of the submarine force in the U.S. Pacific Fleet. And from 2013 to 2015, he was with the U.S. Seventh Fleet, which is why we have him here today, because he is one of the few who really knows the Japan, U.S. and Pacific military relations inside out. He's also a recipient of the Order of the Rising Sun, this one second class with gold and silver star. I don't know whether that came with a neck ribbon or not, but I probably did. Excellent. He also has a Republic of Korea Order of the National Security Merit. So thank you. And also on the occasion of it being Veterans Day tomorrow, Admiral Thomas, thank you for your service. So with that, here's how we have designed our event today. I've asked each of my colleagues to speak for 5 minutes and make the 3 big points of what this all means. And then we'll bring it all together. And also, if you, the audience, would like to type in some questions into the Q&A, I will try to weave those questions into our subsequent conversation. So I thought we'll just do, for lack of a better rule, do ladies first. And so Professor Naoi, why don't you start us out with some thoughts on trade and trade relations. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Ulrike, for a generous introduction. So I'll start with great news. I think we have our new Prime Minister who loves pancakes, and we have a new President-elect who loves ice cream. So this could become a very nice, sweet alliance. Food is ideal. That's my favorite food too, but it's a savory food, not sweet. So today's talk, I'm going to talk about how this Biden-Harris election mean for the U.S.-Japan trade relations. So of course, the question we should be asking is this good news or bad news for global trade? And is this good news or bad news for U.S.-Japan relations? So I start with the good news. I think Nikkei has spoken that this more predictable and business as usual trade policy and immigration policies that we can expect from this team is good for market. I think they rewarded this. You see the rising Nikkei index in a couple of days. So that's a great news. Second, US will return to international organizations and multilateral corporations. So Trump has less Paris agreement. So paying to that show and pull out from UNESCO and all these executive orders that President Trump has issued and followed through will be reversed is our prediction, and probably using executive orders again. So this return to international organizations and multilateral cooperation is generally good news for global trade and population, but also for US-Japan relations, because Japan always has thought multilateral arena as a forum to liberalize trade. So that's good news for US-Japan relations. There are a couple of bad news that's not necessarily due to Democratic Party in power. One is that this COVID-19 and recession definitely have made many countries more inward looking. I'm going to show you some public opinions later. Second is that protectionist sentiments that arose before Trump was elected still continue on among American voters. And this would continue to be strong with the COVID-19 and the recession. The third bad news is that potentially have a divided. It depends on January 5th election in Georgia, etc. But divided government, it will be hard to get anything done. Fourth, US scrutiny and suspicion on Chinese government on various activities that they engage in will continue. But the form of this suspicion and scrutiny might come in different forms. So my prediction would be that instead of focusing on trade imbalance, which President Trump has done, a new team will probably focus on human rights and potentially research activities that are funded by Chinese government. So here's how the pandemic changed public opinion, views on China. So US and Japan, what you see here is that the blue line, which shows a proportion of nationally represented voters expressing unfavorable view of China, has skyrocketed since global pandemic. But what's even more remarkable, I think, is that Japanese public has also increased this anti-China sentiments during the pandemic and also before pandemic. And what we see here is that despite this rise in Japanese public sentiments against China, we do not see much backlash among elites. So if you compare US congressional members, presidential elections, Senate versus Japanese legislators, China bashing among Japanese legislators has been extremely constrained and restrained despite this rise in anti-China sentiments among public. So that's an interesting gap that we should be focusing on to think about the future. Okay, so here's another figure on how the pandemic changed public opinion, making voters more inward-looking. So Biden supporters, Pew Research Center has found that the issues that they most care about was a healthcare and COVID-19 outbreak. Foreign policy took much lower priorities for them. So they're looking more inward. Another figure on the right, what's interesting here is that Japanese public who always revere multilateral organizations like UN, WTO, their opinion on this multilateral organization and international organizations have been actually turning negative. So this is the opinion this is WHO. And WHO, UN, these multilateral organizations, they're becoming much more skeptical about these multilateral organizations and international organizations. And that's partly because they felt probably that their government has done better than WHO in handling the pandemic. You see this competence gap evaluation of Japanese voters creeping into their assessments of other multilateral organizations like UN as well. So that's one worrisome trend that I noticed. Okay, so there are several things that I think is neither good or bad for US-Japan relationship that are quite interesting. So the first is that the Suga-Biden relations is unknown. Said that they share a sweet tooth. They don't have a personal relationships yet. Unlike Abe-Trump honeymoon relations, right? But I think I would argue that not having this close personal relationship can be good for transparency. One thing that we didn't know is that when Prime Minister Abe and President Trump hung out a lot and played golf, what kind of deals were made between them, we cannot know. Whereas Suga-Biden team, I think what they're going to be doing is business as usual diplomacy. So we might have more transparency in what kind of deals that they make. Second point I want to make is that Suga will be more pro-China and pro-Korea than Abe. It's partly because of his economic policy stance that he is a pro-reform and a growth-oriented person who wants to get rid of waste of bureaucracy, getting Hanko traditions, etc., etc. So China is a necessary component of this export-oriented pro-business policy. Second important point is that Suga became prime minister by big endorsement from Nikkei faction. So that's the first factions to actually endorse Prime Minister Suga as a candidate for the position. And Nikkei faction is known to have a very close relationship with South Korea and China. and his main focus of special interest are travel industries, tourism and travel. So I think Suga will be more pro-China, pro-Korea. So their relationship, Japan's relationship between U.S., Korea, China will be a lot more balanced and even than Abe's relationship that emphasized U.S.-Japan alliance. The third point I want to make, and we don't know whether it's going to be a good or bad, is that in terms of economic policy direction, what Suga stands for and what Biden stands for are very, very different. They're not well aligned. So Suga is seeking reform and small governments, which is interesting choice in the COVID recession time that everybody's losing jobs, everybody's suffering economically, but he is going for reform, getting rid of waste, and smaller government. Whereas Biden seeks overhauling healthcare and social safety nets. So he's of course going for a larger government. So whether these two economic ideologies can align well together to promote more trade cooperations or openness is remain to be seen. So the final piece is a moving targets. So of course, Japan, unfortunately, is not the priority for Biden-Harris administration. Addressing any issues with China and South Korea, North Korea, will be more important issues for Biden-Harris administration. So especially the merits is what Chinese government is going to do about human rights violations that have been exposed. And going to continue or improve this dimension with the Democrats returning to power in the United States. There'll be any concession made about the human rights issues and maybe trading the concession with solving the trade issues. South Korea is also a big issue because Biden stands for deterrence of North Korea, and that's not consistent with Moon administration actually seeks. They seek more peace and communication, but that's not what the Democratic government here stands for. Another issue is Biden wants to push this trilateral cooperation among allies, so US, South Korea, Japan. Although South Korea and Japan had engaged in trade wars and export restrictions and comfort women issues, etc., I think Biden's position would be to solve the problem, overcome any conflict, and contribute more to this trilateral alliance. The third moving target is WTO reform. They would decide the director general, and try to enact reforms to promote more trade cooperation. But what they can do in this pandemic is still remain to be seen. Great, I'll end my presentation here, and thank you.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Megumi. It's a great start. So let me go next, since we're going from trade to business before we turn to politics. So I want to take a quick look and make make 3 points on what the election outcome means for Japanese business and how Japanese business people think about it. And for once, I didn't bring PowerPoints, so you have to just listen to me. The first thing no, Ellis, please don't.
Okay.
Please go back out.
Okay.
If you would. Okay, thank you. Let me make my 3 points first. So the first point I would like to make is that we think of Japan as a trading nation, but that's actually no longer really true. So if you look at the numbers, only 18.4% last year of Japan's exports of Japan's GDP was actually exports. So so that compares to 12% in the US. So yes, it's more of a trading country than the US, but 47% in Germany. So Japan is actually no longer really that big of a trading nation. Now, Japan's exports are 700 billion, so 20% of that is nothing to sniff at, but it's not as high as, and so the US is 20% of those exports. But what's much more important for Japanese business is the accumulated FDI of Japanese companies into the United States that started with the U.S.-Japan trade war, which was 30 years ago. And so this has its roots in the voluntary export restraints and the NAFTA and the local content rules and all of these things that the U.S. and Japan fought over in the 80s and 90s. And that brought a lot, like 30 years of accumulated FDI, Japanese FDI, into the United States. So for instance, 75% of Japanese cars driven in the United States are made in the United States. 17 US states have local Japanese auto plants producing more than 4 million cars a year. In 2017, there were 850,000 Americans working for Japanese companies in the US. And if you count the suppliers to those places, it's more than 1.5 million people. And that's more than any other country that has activities in the US. And that's just cars, right? So that doesn't count energy in Texas or finance in New York and the other coast, you know, kind of California, and of course, electronics. It's also not included in this. So it's a huge number. So the point here is that the United States is super important for Japanese business, not just in trade, which has been lesser, and Japan's trade with China is now larger than Japan's trade with the United States, but also with the tremendous amount of $500 billion worth of FDI into the US. And there's some estimate that Japanese companies earn over $450 billion a year in their productions in the United States. So in some ways, this election outcome affects these companies in similar ways than it affects US companies, right? And so what do we say here, what this election means for business? And most people think that the outcome is a dream scenario for business. It's we don't quite know yet, but it looks as if the Senate will stay Republican and the president will be Biden. And so there's a moderate Democratic president that can't do most of the aggressive things that business would not like, right? And so some of the very aggressive things like super high taxes or, so forth is unlikely to happen. Meanwhile, this president is much more predictable, certainty higher, which is something that loves, right? So that's the most important thing, in fact, for CEOs. And this President Biden is also less likely to just pick randomly on one company and badmouth them on some story or some claim that may or may not be funded. Have any foundation. The new administration might also be much more open to foreign workers and the trade relations that Professor Naoi just talked about. So in a way, Biden is a bit less hospitable to business, but much more predictable and certain. And so that actually is something that Japanese CEOs are looking at quite favorably. And so for them, this is actually kind of the best outcome that could possibly have happened. So that bodes well also for U.S.-Japan relations. And I will just stop here because that's all I have to say on this. It's all good in a way. So with that, let me pass the microphone on to Professor Krauss, who wants to show his PowerPoints.
Yes. Okay. Are you seeing me?
Yeah, now you can. Yeah.
You can?
No, I can't. Try it again, please.
Okay. I'm on share screen. There.
Yes, very good.
All right. I'm going to talk about the U.S. election and U.S.-Japan relations generally. I too have 3 points. The first is I want to look at the public's views of the election, then Japanese elites' views, and then the reality of the election, which is a lot more complicated than either. First of all, the public, I believe, did not generally like Trump. There were, of course, Trump supporters in Japan. I found, watching NHK recently, a lot more bias than NHK's coverage of the election than I expected from my studying them a few years ago. Also, Trump's not accepting the results are going to hurt U.S. image in Japan quite a bit. And if there's any further chaos or violence, it will further hurt the image of the U.S. among the public. I notice NHK has been emphasizing a lot of the demonstrations and looting and confrontations in a lot of their videos. The image of the US was already severely damaged by the Trump administration. A Pew survey of the public in among 5 US allies showed that the positive image, and this relates to Megumi's slides too, the positive image of the US fell from 60 to 75% during the Obama administration to 35 to 40% under Trump, almost half. And this occurred also in other US allies like Britain, Canada, and France. So one of the things I would say is that Biden can only make America's image better again. And I would say he should have hats that say, make America better again. So.
Ellis?
Yes.
Some audience is suggesting that you click this play from current slide icon on the top left so that you can have a whole presentation slide. Play from current slide.
Play from current slide. Okay, there we go. Thank you. So the government and part of the media are quite different than the public view, however. Publicly, the government will totally welcome Biden. Prime Minister Suga has already sent him congratulations. But there is also the purported remark by a former Japan ambassador to the US on what happens when US administrations change. And he said, it's like Christmas in front of your relatives. You open the presents and no matter what they gave you, you always say, it's what I always wanted. So I think Japan is going to say that publicly, the government. Privately, I think it's going to be somewhat different. There has been a belief since the 1980s among the LDP, bureaucrats, and some media elites that the Republican presidents are better for Japan than Democratic ones. And they always cite these personal relations between Ronald Reagan and Yasu Nakasone, Bush and Koizumi, Trump and Abe more recently. And in an article that Brad Glossaman and I just published the other day in a Japanese publication, this is a total myth. I can assure you it is. And if you want to know why, I will respond to that in questions and answers if you're interested. My friend Glenn Fukushima and Megumi have pointed out to me that there's also another reason for this, which is that conservative elites are very integrated with Republican elites much more than the Democrats. The reality is that Suga and Biden should get along fairly well. There's even a chance that they can bond. They both are, after all, from non-elite backgrounds, and this might form the basis for a relationship. There's also a bipartisan consensus among Republicans and Democrats in Congress. That is, they are wary of China on security and trade. They differ in the techniques and how wary they are. They are also, I think, fairly in line on they need to manage North Korea and on dampening the South Korea-Japan conflict for US security reasons. Japan and the US also share policy goals on climate change, health, and I believe even the Pan-Pacific trade. It would not surprise me anyway if the US rejoins the TPP, now called the CPTPP, which Trump left, but Japan liked so much it actually helped reestablish without the US. Okay, now rarely discussed, however, is one more thing that I think the advantage that Biden has. That is, any demands, and he will make demands on Japan and other allies, will be compared to Trump's original draconian demands and threats. And therefore, he can negotiate from strength. He will be able to negotiate, they've already started today, I believe, base support, which Trump started, and on trade and imports, particularly automobiles. So any reasonable demand that Biden makes upon US allies, including Japan, I think will be welcome because it is much more rational and better for these countries than anything that Trump would have implemented. The main problem for the US, I think, is distraction. We are going to have a polarized US public, which I think Biden will find difficult to heal. Domestic issues will be huge for the Biden administration, more than foreign policy. As been mentioned, the Republicans will control the Senate, and if they do what they did under Obama, will try to stymie Biden policies on every turn. He will also have trouble from the progressive wing of Democrats. And it is not just the Pacific that Biden has to deal with. He has to heal relations, remember, with the EU and with Britain after Brexit. He has to deal with China. So I think Japan should not get their expectations too high that the US is going to pay as much attention to them in the past as they have in the past. Although I think otherwise, the relationship and the alliance are in very good shape. And I'm sure Admiral Thomas can speak to the fact that our militaries are now probably more integrated than the militaries of almost any other country, and otherwise our security relationship is in good shape. And with that, I'll end.
Great, Ellis. If you could stop your screen share, that would be great.
And
let's hand the microphone over to Admiral Thomas. I call him the professor of practice of war and peace here at GPS. So Robert, it's all yours.
I prefer the peace side of that. And let me just leverage off of Ellis's comments. And for those of you who had a chance, I don't know whether the recent article went out to all the webinar participants, but I commend it to you. One of the key points, and Ellis made it in his presentation, was this idea of multilateralism, and we'll get to that. So what does a Biden-Harris administration look like with respect to the security part of the equation? In particular, let me just put a military lens on it. You know, I was a task force commander over there in Japan, 2010 to 2011. And then, of course, the 7th Fleet Commander, 2013 to 2015. My history in the country goes all the way back to when I was 8 years old living in Iwakuni. So it's a relationship that I absolutely treat as personal. As you look at a Biden-Harris administration, you probably are going to have Michelle Flournoy as the Secretary of Defense. I had the opportunity to work with her when I was on the Joint Staff. Just a superb, policy perspective, globalist. Possibly Tammy Duckworth, a senator from Illinois, might be a choice. Army veteran, lost her legs, helicopter pilot, Iraq. And maybe Jack Reed would be kind of a long shot senator from Rhode Island as you look at the possible secretaries of defense. But as you look at this, I think Ellis has got it exactly right. This is the strongest alliance, especially military to military, that the United States has. Over 50,000 US military are stationed in or in close proximity to Japan. I say that a little bit tongue-in-cheek because as the 7th Fleet Commander, I was never allowed to say that we were home ported in Yokosuka. My Japanese counterparts would always remind me, hey, Thomas, you are forward deployed to Japan. And that's a very interesting, little play on words, but it's important. And so as we look, I think there's 3 parts of this equation that need to happen in the security arrangement. And one of them's counterintuitive. The first, I would say the first key part of this is US ratification of the UN Convention on Law of the Sea. The maritime environment is so important to Japan, and it is so important to the US-Japan alliance. And this pressurization that Japan is feeling now more than ever in the East China Sea, compliments of the People's Republic of China in the Southwest Islands. It is absolutely important for the US to ratify the UN Convention on Law of the Sea so they can be at the table with Japan and with South Korea. I think Ellis has got it exactly right. The second part of that equation is to get back into the Trans-Pacific Partnership. That is the big strategic piece. I used to talk about that when I was the 7th Fleet Commander, and they said, "Aren't you the military guy?" I said, "Yeah, but the big strategic underpinning is the Trans-Pacific Partnership." So, you know, job one, I think, is clearly over in the Biden-Harris camp of getting those things done. It's going to be tough with a Republican Senate. There are still some holdovers, kind of, you know, post-John McCain senators that will chafe against ratifying UNCLOS, but that's got to be done. Secondly, and this is something I've been suggesting, you know, since 2010, is this need for the Japanese government to stand up what we would call in the United States a joint interagency task force for the Southwest Islands. And I would have the Japanese Coast Guard be in charge of it, not the military, not the self-defense force. It would include law enforcement. I would also include US counterparts in this standing task force. Because right now in the East China Sea, when the PRC makes a move, either with their maritime militia or their Coast Guard incursions into the Ryukyus, Japan is hampered by this kind of stovepiped lack of horizontal communication. The Coast Guard can't talk to the Kaijojieitai and other parts of the government very easily. And so this joint interagency task force, it's not a new idea. The US and some of our allies to the south use it in Key West. It's called JIATA South, so Joint Interagency Task Force South. We use it mostly there in the Caribbean for counter narcotics, to counter human trafficking, those kinds of things, but it absolutely could be used in the Southwest Islands. And then the third piece, and Ellis has already talked about it, and that is this need to, and I was very encouraged when you said the Suga-san probably will lean in to better relations with the Republic of Korea. Absolutely, we need to get the trilateral piece of the security arrangements figured out. Military to military to military, that happens all the time. It happens below the radar of Blue House and Ichigaya, but it absolutely happens all the time. So the ROC military, especially the ROC Navy, the JMSDF, and the US 7th Fleet, they operate routinely all the time. This is one of those strange times where we need the military model to encourage this political rapprochement, if you will, to tighten up the security arrangement, because that's not only important for Japan and Korea, it's frankly important for the entire region. So I'll leave it at that, and definitely looking forward to the discussion and the questions.
So yes, sorry, I had to unmute myself. So we have a question from Hiraki, and it's popped up here. So the CPTPP. So Megumi, this is your bailiwick. You're the trade czar. What is the what's the probability that the U.S. will rejoin that? I think you're muted. Megumi, are you there?
Oh, you're asking me?
Yeah. I'm asking you. You are a trade czar here, right? You wrote a whole book about trade and.
So Biden did not want to touch TPP or CP during the election campaign period because he knew that the Rust Belt voters are swing voters who betrayed the Democrats last time. So with Trump winning this many votes, that despite that U.S. is losing lots of people to COVID, right? Despite this polarized responses, tells me that I don't think Biden could move super fast on trade deals like CPTPP. So I wouldn't. Maybe the Middle East style cooperation that Professor Thomas has suggested would work, but not in a way that you require legislation of two branches of legislatures. I don't think would happen soon. That would be my guess.
Can I jump in here, Ulrike?
Please.
I think Megumi's absolutely right. He cannot touch it for a while. There's still, because Trump has fomented this anti-trade, anti-multilateralism thing. But I think he won't touch it in his first year, perhaps. I think he will eventually renegotiate the US entry with concessions for American workers that would give him some political cover. And that would be my bet. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, Trump withdrew us from TPP without any legislative involvement. That was an executive order. And I think Biden could do the same to go back in, but again, not immediately and with concessions for American workers to give him political cover.
All right, so the short answer is we don't know, but maybe it's just that people are not talking about it. So we have an interesting question about the view of the Democrats, and part of this question goes to Ellis, and the other goes to Robert. So the question for Robert is actually from Neil. He wants to know whether it is true or false that historically under the Democrats, the budget for the military has been cut, and he reminds you of what probably he talks about how 3 years ago the 7th Fleet had this budget cut, and and so forth and so on. So is there a concern that the military budget will be cut? And then that's a view of what Democrats have done in the past, and so therefore what they might do in the future. And so for Ellis, a similar question is, the Japanese public has long thought that the Republicans are better for Japan somehow. And so you mentioned the myth of the good relations with our friends, the Republicans. So where do these impressions come from? Is there anything to that? Are there hard numbers on the budget side? Are there hard numbers on security? What do you think? Either one can go first on this.
Go ahead, Admiral. Robert?
All right. Yeah, the current defense budget in the United States, when you tally it all up, is about $735 billion a year. Michelle Flournoy, if she's the SecDef, I suspect the military budget will take a haircut, but it's needed. I would think that the most likely area for the Biden-Harris administration to take some savings from defense would be in the nuclear modernization area. This is the strategic nuclear deterrent. It is aging. Most of it's about 40 years old, but I think they will go ahead and sharpen the pencil and say, hey, we're going to go ahead and take some risk there so that we can, save some dollars and probably run it back down into the high 600 billions. You're not going to see a peace dividend a la the Clinton administration. I remind everybody that, the Clinton administration in their final year actually generated a budget surplus. The first time in my lifetime. And so it won't be that severe, but it absolutely will go down, and it needs to, right? I mean, you've got this absolute disconnect that needs to be repaired. And I think that the Biden-Harris administration will do that. They're going to get some heavy resistance on Capitol Hill.
If I could just bring up a couple of more slides, Ulrike.
Can. All right, that looks promising.
No, it isn't. I got to go ahead here. Okay, there we go. I happen to anticipate this question, and this is a big myth. I mean, at least among the elite, that is a myth, and I think even among the public to some extent, because first of all, the LDP has played this up, and so has some media elites. And they always point to the personal relationships, et cetera. What they always forget is that Ronald Reagan imposed more sanctions and tariffs and quotas on trade, Megumi, if I'm not mistaken, than any Democratic president. They forget the Nixon shocks, which were the greatest shock to the Japanese when Nixon went to China without even telling his most important ally in the Pacific, I believe 30 minutes before he finally told them. Clinton, on the other hand, in the framework talks, unlike Reagan, did not impose sanctions when essentially his strategy failed. He walked away, claimed victory, no sanctions. And Obama did the pivot to the Pacific and also went into TPP. Trump, on the other hand, withdrew from TPP. So there's no empirical evidence in policy, at least, that Republicans are any better for Japan than Democrats. The myth is, of course, that conservatives like other conservatives. So you would expect the LDP to cozy up more to conservatives. But there are some very mundane reasons for this myth as well. The three prime ministers that they always talk about, Nakasone, Koizumi, Abe, they were in office longer than any prime ministers that the Democrats had to deal with. So they were able to cultivate the relationship with American presidents. Also, these prime ministers were the best Japan, I think, has ever had in the post-war at public relations. And they knew that close relationships with a president helps their image domestically. And I think Nakasone started this with his Ron Yasu and his multilateral meetings on television that he emphasized. Plus, these were prime ministers that broke the most military taboos of any post-war Japanese prime ministers. This the US appreciated very well, and American presidents were, of course, happy to help improve their domestic image at home. So for all those reasons, I think it is a myth, and I think that the empirical evidence supports that. I don't think you can point to any policies that the close relationships of these prime ministers with American president, where they actually succeeded in somehow getting an American president to do something that was more in their interests. American presidents and Japanese prime ministers always act for their national interests, depending on the circumstances.
Well, wow. So, okay, so there's nothing from precedent here that we should, take anything for granted or anything like that. So I have a few questions on my comments, and Megumi, I may need your help in answering these because I think I need a political scientist to help me parse this through. So I mentioned the dream scenario, which is actually not the dream scenario necessarily for the United States, which is that things are split and so nothing much happens and everything is stable and that's great for business. It may or may not be good for the country. The questions we got from Julia and Hiraki are, so what happens if that does not happen, right? So what if the Senate goes to the Democrats, and what will then be the view of Japanese business, and also a second maybe related question is what we think how the Democrats will do going forward. Will the far left, which has clear anti-business sentiments, have a bigger voice? So Megumi, you want to help me with this, because especially the latter one, I think that I would be very curious to hear what you have to say.
Great question. So definitely, there's no question about that. If the Democrats took over Georgia in January, tax would be higher. So that's one. And Democrats will be able to legislate many policies that could change business environment. But my guess would be that one of the first things that they're going to take care of with legislation will be domestic. So Japanese companies investing in the United States, I think they might get affected. I don't know what type of policies would affect them, including tax, potentially environmental regulation, etc. But in terms of foreign economic policy, I wouldn't expect movement in the first year or two. So, and far left, I think the far left of the Democrats, the main concern they have is about the domestic policy.
Megumi, except climate change, I think.
Policy, I don't think.
Megumi?
Except what?
Climate policy.
Yes.
Climate change, that's the exception, I think.
So, but climate change, actually, Suga has announced that that's one of the things he want to take care of, right? So that's a big statement. So when I think of it, I think the climate change reform can be a point of interest for two countries to cooperate and do something. So that's and another thing I want to emphasize is that yes, so clean energy, renewable energy can be anti-business, but after the nuclear incidents, Japanese government's been pumping the subsidies into alternative energy development and sources. So in fact, and in the United States, during the Great Recession, that's the jobs. It was not the highway projects. It was actually renewable energy, because installing wind energy and the solars were, in fact, created a lot of low-skill jobs as well as high-end tech jobs. So I would say that this corporation, climate corporation, can be good job generations for the next 10, 20 years. So
yeah, I completely agree with that. So Suga made an announcement just a couple hours ago. 2050 is the goal year, right? And so Nippon Steel people are quite worried, but everybody else is saying, yeah, we knew this was coming. So, and there's a tremendous investments, as you said, in innovation and also some advances. So more environmental restrictions would actually be good for Japanese business, I think, in an interesting way, because they would make the infrastructure for it. So I could see that. And I'm also not sure. We hear a lot from the far left, right, and they're attractive, and they're reported on. It's not clear to me that the entire Democratic Party is going to go that far, for a large number of strategic reasons, including that there will be another election in 4 years, and so right, and or in 2 years even, yeah. So it's not clear that being a centrist is actually a bad choice. So we'll have to see how that works out. And I'm sure there are many of our listeners in Japan are very curious to hear where that's going. We have a few more questions on, real quick, Megumi and Ellis. Will Suga be reelected?
I don't think he even knows.
We don't know.
I think he is definitely going for it. And That's my guess. And I haven't seen the contender rising after Suga's election yet, right? So we don't know, and I don't think Suga knows.
So I have a little bit more interest in the U.S. In the matters that Admiral Thomas knows most about. There's a question from Kohei, who is a student of ours from the Ministry of Defense in Japan, and there's also another question from Kosuke that has to do with a Japanese concern that the U.S. might actually change its national defense strategy and its national security strategy. And not related to that, but if I may pile it all on, Robert, and then you can pick the part of the question that you'd like to answer. Will the U.S. demand Japan to pay more? And how about Article 9 now that Abe is no longer there?
Yeah, so I can tell that Kohei Matsumoto was part of the genesis of that question. One of my best students, I might add. I think what's going to be so interesting is the cost sharing issues. And I think that the entire panel has touched on this. The rhetoric of the current administration is going to be put aside. And so you're going to have, first of all, civility in the discussion, which is extremely important in the alliance, especially for our Japanese partners. And so interestingly enough, I think in a Biden-Harris administration, the cost sharing issues are going to be put aside. They'll get resolved, but they're not going to be talked about very much. It will be quietly resolved without a lot, there won't be any tweets. And we'll go back to what I call message discipline. I watched it when I was on the joint staff in the Obama White House. When I'd go over to the White House, it was clear that there was this absolute message discipline. And for the last 3.5 years, we've been in an undisciplined arrangement. And that's always, my counterparts in Japan would always get very, very nervous with that undisciplined, kind of anything goes messaging. So I think the cost sharing issue will be resolved quietly. And so from Japan's perspective, I think that's a positive. With respect to the security relationship in the larger sense, I agree with Ellis and Megumi that frankly, the relationship, the alliance is so strong. I mean, it just weathered 3.5 years of pretty tough sledding. And I would argue that it's the tightest security relationship we have on the planet. Okay. Oh, by the way, and people forget this, that the Japanese Self-Defense Force, from a capability and a capacity perspective, is the top US military ally on the planet. Now, obviously, there's some constraints, and it brings us to Article 9. Prime Minister Abe absolutely pushed that envelope, I think, as far as he could, or it needs to go. You know, the Japanese ability to participate in collective self-defense, their areas of operation, their UN peacekeeping, all of that is much further along than anybody would have imagined a decade ago. So I think it's now time to consolidate those gains and let's not push it any further.
If I could just jump in here for 1 minute and say I completely agree. I think there will be a resolution for the base support issue. I think Biden will go for an increase in base support, but it will be minimal compared to Trump. I mean, maybe instead of doubling, it'll be a 10 or 15 or 20% increase. I think the Japanese will go for it and it'll get resolved quietly without much emphasis. Suga is a disciple of Abe's, and he says he wants to do constitutional reform. I think that's an impossibility, just as it was for Abe. And they will continue to break small taboos one at a time, just as all the successful Japanese post-war prime ministers have done when it comes to the military. The one thing I worry about is how far you can get a constitution that's so out of whack with the reality of Japanese military. As the Admiral's talking about, it is such a powerful military in many ways, but the Constitution says it shouldn't be there at all. So, you know, how far can you extend this without breaking it and something happening that will bring the public awareness to this gap in the relationship between the Constitution and the military?
So I could go on forever. And as I told us when we were little, when it's the best time, it's time to leave. Thank you, dear colleagues, to spend an hour of your time and bringing up the Zoom energy to join me here. It was a terrific conversation. Let's do a redo in maybe in a few months and see what transpires and whether we want to revise any of the things we've said here today. Is there anybody with last thoughts on this? Or are we all? I think that I would like to, thank you, Robert, for putting this all in a very positive note at the end. I mean, the relationship between Japan and the US is so tight, it has survived many things. And it will survive this. It's tight for a large number of reasons. It's very pragmatic reasons, and also a deep appreciation, I think, between these two, the people in these two countries, and a realization that it's all noise. At the heart, this is a deep friendship. So, so thank you for bringing this point out today, and I look forward to seeing you when we can back at school and in the classrooms. So until then, stay well and stay safe. Everybody, thank you for joining us today. Next week, we're going to the movies with Daisuke Miyao, who will tell us all about the history of the Japanese cinema. So join us then, and until then, stay well. Goodbye.
You too.
Thank you.
Thank
All of
you.
you, stay well.
Goodbye.